The story begins in a beautiful city filled with tall buildings that shine under the sun and a welcoming atmosphere that invites you to stroll through its streets. Within that city, in a particular house, someone was busy with their daily tasks. In the kitchen of that house, a maid was meticulously preparing the meal with dedication and care. Her expression showed the concentration with which she worked. The maid began cutting the vegetables, selecting each one with precision, and preparing all the necessary ingredients to craft an exquisite dish. She grabbed a ladle and prepared to taste the seasoning of the soup bubbling in the pot. Upon tasting a bit, her face showed a slight grimace of displeasure. It seemed the meal was missing something essential, perhaps a touch of salt or some spice. She quickly turned and called her daughter's name with a firm but loving voice. In the background, a blonde girl with a muscular body shaped by exercise was lifting weights, focused on her workout routine. The blonde girl's name was Nayeon, and at that moment, she was sweating from the effort of her morning exercises. Her daily routine included weightlifting and stretching, demonstrating her dedication to staying in shape. "Can you go wake up your oppa?" asked the maid, the tone that mixed love and authority. Nayeon, hearing her mother's request, merely glanced over, showing a slight expression of resignation. A while later, Nayeon entered a room with a completely happy smile, enthusiastically exclaiming that it was time to wake up. Upon entering, she noticed something that surprised her. There was a boy sleeping at the desk with books and notebooks scattered around him, the result of an intense night of studying. That boy's name was Yong. Nayeon carefully observed Yong, noticing the details of his calm and relaxed face as he slept. In her mind, she couldn't help but think how cute he looked when he was sleeping, a thought she couldn't avoid. Apparently, she didn't want to interrupt his sleep and just kept watching him, with a mixture of tenderness and admiration, enjoying that moment of tranquility before the day began for both of them. Suddenly, Nayeon approached carefully, moving with the same subtlety as a cat, and began touching Jong's back. The soft touch of her fingers on his skin provoked a reaction in her own body, making her face turn a deep shade of red as strange feelings welled up inside her. Nayeon continued to touch his back delicately, and feeling braver, she slightly moved her hand to caress Yong's face. The texture of his skin and the stillness of his sleeping expression fascinated her, creating a silent connection between the two. The silence enveloped the entire room, wrapping the atmosphere in an almost magical calm, and Nayeon, still blushing, continued to watch her oppa's face closely. But suddenly, her expression changed, and with a determined gesture, she grabbed his cheek tightly and told him in a firm tone to wake up, reminding him it was time to go to school. They began arguing loudly, their raised voices filling the space, and the sounds could be heard all the way to the kitchen where the maid was. Yong, the protagonist, was upset because the abrupt wake-up had caused him to cramp up in his legs, making him writhe in pain as he tried to get up. Nayeon turned around with a playful smile and asked, "What do you think of my new leggings? Do you like them?" The unexpected question left the protagonist momentarily stunned, not knowing what to respond. However, regaining his composure with a confident move, he gave her a slap on the butt and with a mischievous smile told her they looked very nice and that they should go eat. Nayeon hadn't expected that kind of response, and she could only feel her body tingle from the unexpected gesture. Both of them came down from the room with renewed energy. Yong was ahead, while Nayeon followed closely, their footsteps lightly echoing on the stairs. Upon reaching the kitchen, the maid greeted them with a warm smile and asked, "Did you wake up, Jong?" Still a bit drowsy, he first said good morning, and then asked if they had slept well. The maid, hearing the concern in Yong's voice, only managed to look at him with love and a slight blush on her cheeks. With a soft but cheerful voice, the maid told them she had made silver miso soup for breakfast, a specialty that always managed to cheer everyone up in the house. The protagonist was very happy to hear this, knowing that silver miso soup was one of his favorite meals. It had been a year since Yong started living in that house. As he prepared for the day, he began to recall what his life had been like before moving. He remembered being in his old home, eagerly awaiting the results of his university exam. Suddenly, with a shout of joy, he announced that he had been accepted into a prestigious university in Seoul. His mother and sisters quickly approached to congratulate him, while he, with a big smile, told them he had earned second place in the exam and also a full scholarship. He proudly added that he had finally fulfilled his promise of moving to Seoul and studying at one of the best universities in the country. However, Jong's mother, worried, exclaimed that the family's financial situation wasn't very good and that they wouldn't be able to afford his stay in Seoul. Despite the warning, Young, full of excitement and enthusiasm, didn't listen to those words. He was determined to take advantage of the opportunity he had worked so hard to earn. Several days passed, and Young was finally in Seoul. He was fascinated and amazed to be in such a big city for the first time. As he explored his new surroundings, a beautiful, voluptuous woman accompanied by her daughter, who also had attractive curves, arrived to pick him up. Young watched them curiously, not entirely understanding what was happening. Just then, Young's phone rang. It was a call from his mother. With a worried voice, she told him that Seoul was a very big and scary city, and that it would be difficult for him to live alone. She suggested he contact her friend Yuna, who lived nearby and had shared many moments of his childhood, to see if she could take him in. A little embarrassed by the sudden situation, Young turned around and, with some shyness, asked the women if they had met when he was a child. The women, without saying a word, stared at him with looks full of memories and nostalgia. He observed them carefully, trying to remember some detail. Suddenly, his memory began to clear, and he managed to recall that when he was a child, he had visited Seoul and was warmly welcomed by his mother's friend. That visit left a warm and lasting impression on his mind. The maid, always practical, grabbed Young's luggage and firmly ordered him inside, commenting that it was very cold outside. Without further ado, they led him into his new home. Thus, unexpectedly but warmly, Young ended up living with his mother's friend and her daughter. In the present, Young was savoring the delicious breakfast the maid had carefully prepared. As he enjoyed each bite, he felt grateful for the kindness and hospitality of these women, who had welcomed him into their home as if he were part of the family. "Don't you have in-person classes?" Yuna asked. Intrigued, without losing her composure, her daughter replied with a smile, saying that even in webtoons, attendance wasn't necessary. Yuna started to wander in her thoughts, thinking that all this technology and new ways of studying were very complicated for her. With a pensive expression, she turned to the protagonist and asked how the stew was, and if he found it to have a strange taste. Young, always polite, responded that it was delicious, thanking her for every bite. The person in front of Jong was his mother's friend, Aunt Yuna. Although it was a request from a close friend, Haeseong wondered if she owed his mother any favor, trying to understand why she had taken him in so kindly. However, he quickly dismissed that thought, concluding that couldn't be the case, and that Aunt Yuna was just a good-hearted person, always willing to help. Well, aside from being kind-hearted, she's also an angel fallen from the sky, Haeseong thought, admiring Yuna's kindness and beauty. An angel, an angel, an angel. The protagonist stammered, his eyes wider than soup plates, unable to look away from Yuna's generous breasts. Unable to resist, the protagonist dove into a sea of fantasies about Yuna, seeing her as beautiful as a spring flower. He drooled, imagining 1,001 scenarios with beautiful Yuna as the star of his thoughts. Nayeon, sitting right in front of him, noticed within 2 seconds that the protagonist's head was in the clouds. Without a second thought, and discreetly, Nayeon stretched her leg under the table. She made contact and started massaging the protagonist's lower part. The effect was instant. He felt as though he'd been plugged into an electrical socket. A jolt ran through his body from top to bottom, and after what felt like an eternity, he collapsed onto the table, completely embarrassed. Yuna, looking startled, seemed more concerned than a first-time mother. Meanwhile, Nayeon, as calm as ever, announced she was going to school, acting as if nothing had happened. The protagonist couldn't help but think that his friend only resembled her mother in looks, as she didn't have a shred of sweetness or consideration. Nayeon was about to leave the house for university when, suddenly, she heard her mother call her with an urgent tone. She stopped abruptly, turning on her heels, and upon looking back, she realized her mother, Yuna, was holding a bento in her hands. Visibly nervous, Yuna started stammering as she offered the bento to her daughter. "I made steamed chicken," she said with a trembling voice, "and I thought maybe you'd like to take it with you for the day." Her mother's offer seemed like a sincere attempt to show affection, though the tension in the air was palpable. The relationship between mother and daughter didn't seem to be at its best, and this small interaction appeared to reflect the emotional distance between them. The protagonist, Young, who was present during the scene, watched silently, noting the awkwardness of the situation. Later on, he would have to play a crucial role in trying to resolve this friction and help improve the relationship between Yuna and her daughter. Nayeon, blushing and a little uncomfortable, didn't quite know how to react to her mother's offer. With a mix of gratitude and shyness, she took the bento from Yuna's hands and thanked her, albeit a bit hesitantly. Young, who was also present, observed the scene and approached to say goodbye to his aunt with a polite smile, thanking her for her hospitality. Just before he left, Yuna, still visibly worried, called out Young's name with an expression full of both affection and seriousness. "Take care of my daughter," she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. The protagonist, smiling, bid farewell to Yuna as he left the house, promising he would take good care of Nayeon, without knowing in what way. As they walked to school together, the fresh morning air accompanied them. Nayeon, with a curious look and a slight smile on her lips, asked her Oppa if he had a girlfriend. She reminded him that the second semester was about to end and asked if there was any girl he was interested in. The protagonist, looking at the ground as they walked, responded that he had been so busy lately with his studies and adjusting to his new life in the city that he hadn't had a minute to think about having a girlfriend. Upon hearing his response, Nayeon, with a disdainful expression, reminded him that he had said the same thing the previous year. She told him not to let his youth slip by while being immersed in his studies, suggesting that he needed to balance studying with some fun and socializing. Isn't that normal for university students? The protagonist asked, somewhat confused by her advice. Nayeon responded with a slightly mocking smile that while it was important to study, it was also essential to enjoy university life, spend time with friends, and meet new people. University guys should have a lot of fun too, Nayeon concluded, emphasizing her point. Various scenes unfolded on the university campus, showing groups of students walking in pairs along tree-lined paths. Amid this bustle, the protagonist looked around and felt sad as he noticed he was the only one completely immersed in his studies, while others enjoyed their time with their partners. Suddenly, Nayeon's attention was drawn to a couple who seemed to break away from the main group, heading toward a more secluded corner of the campus hidden among the vegetation. Unable to help himself, the protagonist wondered if they were looking for privacy to share something more than just a walk. Nayeon, with a determined expression and a hint of mischief in her eyes, hinted that a noble person must always seek the truth behind things, suggesting she was willing to discover exactly what the couple was doing in that secluded spot. The couple, now in a hidden corner of the campus, was enjoying their time together. The scene was a mix of soft laughter and loving whispers as they immersed themselves in their small oasis of intimacy. The protagonist, watching from a safe distance, felt even more disheartened. The injustice of the situation hit him hard, as while others enjoyed their youth and love without restrictions, he felt trapped in an endless cycle of studying and responsibility. Young was observing the scene with a mix of fascination and embarrassment, his face visibly reddening. Nayeon, standing beside him, whispered with a mischievous smile that despite the uncomfortable situation, there was quite an interesting view. Curiosity and unease started playing with Yong's nerves as he wondered if it was possible for people so dedicated to studying to also find ways to have fun intensely, just like those now in front of them. As erotic sounds and moans began to fill the air, an atmosphere charged with intimacy and desire took over, making both Jong and Nayeon blush in unison. Nayeon, her face still flushed and slightly stammering, tried to keep her composure. Pretending not to be affected by the situation, she asked Young to stop watching and suggested they leave before getting caught. Nayeon noticed something that completely surprised her. Jong's little friend, which had been inactive until then, had woken up and was clearly reacting to the stimulating scene in front of them. The couple in the corner was so immersed in their activities that the intensity of what they were doing was almost indescribable. John and Nayeon were left stunned by everything they had witnessed. The scene was far more intense than they had imagined. Later, John and Nayeon entered their classroom with their cheeks still burning with embarrassment, trying to hide the deep blush that overtook them. They couldn't avoid the awkward silence between them and refrained from mentioning the scene they had witnessed. Already in the classroom, Nayeon and Jong were curiously observing the couple who had previously been intimate. The atmosphere in the room was a bit tense with whispers and furtive glances. Both were silently wondering what would happen now that the couple was there. The protagonist, with a mix of surprise and curiosity, thought to himself, after all, they showed up to class. At the end of the day, they must care about studying. His thoughts reflected the incredulity of the moment, trying to make sense of the couple's actions. Nayeon, trying to process what she was seeing, responded that she hadn't expected anything like that. "I never imagined I'd see something like this," she said, shaking her head slightly, her voice filled with astonishment as if she still couldn't believe what was happening before her eyes. "What did you expect to see then?" asked the protagonist with a mix of curiosity and confusion, his question lingering in the air, echoing in Nayeon's mind. Blushing slightly, Nayeon admitted that she only thought they'd be kissing. "I didn't expect to see people doing that," she added, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, her cheeks tinged with a faint blush, a sign of her discomfort. She added that it seemed a bit strange to be doing that in the classroom. "I won't be able to get the image of the class president out of my head all day," she murmured almost to herself, as if trying to process the situation. Suddenly, a classmate shouted from the back of the room, "Don't talk so loud." The sudden intervention made the protagonist and Nayeon quickly shrink back, their hearts beating a little faster from the shock. Jong told Nayeon she shouldn't be so upset, and after all, that's how they came into the world, trying to ease her with a bit of humor. However, his words didn't seem to have the desired effect. All of a sudden, The protagonist felt a strange sensation running through his mind, as if a series of thoughts had suddenly invaded. He began imagining Yuna telling him she'd had trouble with her wedding and asking him to have a child with her. The scene unfolded vividly in his mind, making him question if he was truly ready for something like that. Blushing deeply, he apologized to Nayeon for oversharing, his voice trembling slightly, reflecting his embarrassment and regret for having let his thoughts slip. Nayeon, meanwhile, looked around carefully and noticed many other couples. This made her think about what it might mean for others to see her and Young together. Feeling a little self-conscious, she quickly began to blush, her cheeks turning a soft pink that betrayed her. Stammering slightly, she told Young that if they stayed together, everyone would think they were dating. It was a genuine concern she couldn't help but express. The protagonist quickly responded that she should stop thinking such nonsense and start taking notes so she wouldn't end up asking him for notes later. He was trying to steer the conversation toward something more practical and less embarrassing. The teacher, who was giving the lecture, noticed that the protagonist and his friend were chatting and called them out, her voice echoing through the classroom, making them both feel embarrassed as they quickly focused on the lesson. "Nayeon, come see me after class," the teacher exclaimed, her voice echoing across the room and drawing everyone's attention. Later, Nayeon was complaining to the teacher about being made to carry boxes, arguing that she was too hard on women, her voice a mix of frustration and exhaustion. Elag, who was also present, wondered silently how the boxes could feel heavy for her if she lifted weights every morning. The teacher sighed and, with a serious look, replied that their mothers would be proud, adding, "How can you be so arrogant?" Her words were firm, but there was a hint of resignation in her tone. This teacher, with a slender figure and beautiful face, was the friend of Aunt Yuna. Her name was Guso Yeon, and her commanding presence always garnered respect from the students. The protagonist and his friend started arguing, their voices gradually rising. Soyeon sighed lightly, watching them with a mixture of patience and weariness. Suddenly, Soyeon's phone began to ring, surprising her, the ringtone breaking the tense atmosphere and diverting both of their attention. She answered the call, and to everyone's surprise, it was the manager. They began talking about work matters, and the protagonist watched her as she spoke while continuing to carry the box with visible effort, intrigued by the conversation and trying to distract himself from his task. In that moment, Nayeon placed her box on top of Young's as if it were a joke. Her gesture was playful, her eyes shining with mischief, trying to lighten the atmosphere with her game. "You're going to carry it? Thanks a lot, Oppa," Nayeon said with a mischievous smile. The protagonist, clearly annoyed by the situation, replied that she should stop being ridiculous, his voice reflecting his irritation. Meanwhile, Soyeon continued talking on the phone and seemed to be receiving complaints from the manager. Her expression turned tense, and her voice took on a more serious tone as she lowered her gaze and sighed deeply, trying to calm herself and maintain her composure. It was evident that the conversation was affecting her. She turned and looked at the protagonist, who was struggling with the two boxes, and asked, "What happened to Nayeon? Where did she go?" Her voice reflecting a mix of curiosity and concern. Soyeon, seeing that the protagonist was having difficulties, approached to help him carry the boxes. She thought it was too heavy for him alone, her gesture showing a mix of understanding and support. "What was that long sigh about?" the protagonist asked, trying to understand the reason for Soyeon's sigh. His words sought a connection, trying to discover what had disturbed her so deeply. Soyeon apologized, and with a soft, sad tone, told him that she had been fired, her words carrying a clear weight, reflecting the surprise and disappointment she felt about the news. She added that as of next semester, she wouldn't be teaching, which surprised the protagonist. This revelation left him feeling puzzled and concerned about his teacher's future. Soyeon sighed deeply and commented that it was truly a shame to have been dismissed, her eyes showing a trace of sadness, but also resigned acceptance. The protagonist, trying to show empathy, intervened and told her that it must be really hard, apologizing for not knowing how to cheer her up, his voice reflecting his sincere desire to help. Soyeon smiled slightly and thanked him for wanting to console her, appreciating his gesture of kindness. With determination, Soyeon dropped the boxes to the floor and exclaimed that she no longer cared about being fired, her voice taking on a tone of defiance, as if she were ready to face the situation with courage. "Hey, handsome student here, do you want to have a drink with me?" Soyeon suddenly asked, a playful smile on her face. Her invitation broke the tense atmosphere, leaving the protagonist a little bewildered, but also intrigued by the unexpected proposal. Blushing slightly and with a mix of nervousness and curiosity, he replied that he was up for it. His mind was full of questions, and his heart pounded as he wondered what he was getting into. Soyeon, visibly happy, exclaimed enthusiastically that she wouldn't take him back. Her energy and determination seemed to infect the protagonist, although he was still somewhat dazed by the situation. Later, they were both in a car, the atmosphere charged with tension and anticipation, with the vehicle parked in a secluded spot. The protagonist was lying back in the seat, completely flushed and unable to believe what was happening before his eyes. Everything felt surreal, as if he were living a strange dream. Above him was Soyeon, undressing slowly, her movements deliberate and assured as she asked the protagonist to go through with it. The scene was intense and charged with emotion, leaving the protagonist speechless, completely absorbed in the moment. The liquor store owner bid the protagonist and his companion farewell, advising them to be careful, his tone laced with concern as he noted the state the teacher was in. Yang was holding his teacher, trying to keep her from falling to the ground. He held her firmly, struggling to support her as Soyeon, completely drunk, couldn't stand on her own. Yang helped her walk, worried about her state and making sure she wouldn't get hurt. As he watched Soyeon appear to fall asleep, Jang questioned what he should do in situations like that. He recalled that he was trying to cheer his teacher up. That was his main goal, although the circumstances had taken an unexpected turn. Upon learning that the protagonist couldn't drink, Soyeon burst into laughter, her laughter contagious but also revealing her altered state. "Humans are like this. You'll have to manage your loneliness for the rest of your life," Soyeon said amid laughter, her tone blending amusement with a hint of mockery. She added playfully that when he went on a date and got action, he'd forget things for a while. Her words were direct and filled with innuendo. The protagonist, completely blushing, asked if he should hear things like that. His voice trembled slightly, reflecting his discomfort and surprise at Soyeon's remarks. A little annoyed, Soyeon responded that he shouldn't be embarrassed and pointed out that he was a man who had never had a relationship. Pointing at him, she said he should go out a lot while he was still young, or he would regret it. Her words carried a mix of advice and reprimand, as if she were sharing a universal truth. The protagonist calmed down a little, watching her intently, and replied that he would take her advice. His voice was more serene, trying to show respect for Soyeon's words. Professor Gu Soyeon, not Aunt Soyeon, was an important figure in his life, a direct connection to his mother and Aunt Yuna. Their relationship went beyond school formalities. His mother, Aunt Yuna, and Aunt Soyeon had been friends since childhood. This deep, long-lasting friendship was something he had always heard about and admired. They often traveled together. Well, that's what they told him. Although he didn't remember all the details, he knew those experiences had been significant for them all. With a determined tone, Jang told his teacher she'd had enough to drink, trying to set a limit out of concern for her state. Before leaving, the protagonist and Soyeon toasted with a glass of soju, marking a symbolic moment, a close for an intense and emotional night. Jang didn't like the taste. He found it totally bland, yet he decided not to complain, wanting to keep the peace and goodwill. He looked ahead, surprised to see his teacher asleep at the table. The scene was almost comical, but also concerned him about Soyeon's state, and so we returned to the present, where the protagonist had helped Soyeon into her car, finding himself in a delicate situation as he tried to handle everything with care. He was talking to someone, telling them there was a convenience store nearby and that they were in the car parking lot. His words were precise, looking for a solution to Soyeon's state and ensuring everything stayed under control. He hung up the phone and questioned what he had asked for and if they would be okay. His thoughts were full of doubts and uncertainty, trying to ensure everything went well. Soyeon woke up, still slightly drunk, noticing that Yang was outside the car. Her eyes barely opened, but she saw his figure in the darkness. "What are you doing standing there?" she asked in a sleepy voice. Yang replied that he was waiting for the replacement driver. His answer was brief and straightforward, trying to explain his presence outside the vehicle. Soyeon told him not to wait outside and to get in the car with her. Her tone was insistent, not wanting to be alone at that moment. The protagonist, a little flushed, responded that it was okay and told her not to worry, trying to calm her. "Do you want to make me feel bad?" Soyeon asked, annoyed, her voice reflecting a mix of frustration and vulnerability. Yang, having no choice, accepted the invitation and got into the car, feeling slightly uncomfortable but determined to stay with her. He sat down, and with a quick movement, Soyeon lay on the protagonist's lap. Her actions were unexpected, and Yang didn't know how to react in that situation, his mind full of questions. "I'll borrow your knee to sleep for a while," Soyeon said, whispering softly. Jang, though surprised, whispered that it was okay and that he would lend her his knee to rest a bit. While she slept, Soyeon began to apologize in a low voice. Her words were confused and full of regret. "It seems funny to me that a woman who has lost her marriage is trying to give advice on how to live to someone else," she added in a broken voice. Her confessions showed deep sadness and self-criticism, revealing her vulnerability to Jang. "That's not the case, Professor," the protagonist exclaimed with a voice full of determination. He added that he thought she was a really amazing person, that she was kind, and that the students had a lot of respect for her. "I respect you a lot as a teacher, too," he continued, making Soyeon blush a little, her cheeks turning a faint shade of red. surprised by the unexpected compliment. The protagonist, enthusiastic, exclaimed that none of her facets were pathetic, his eyes shining with sincerity as he tried to convince her to value herself more. Soyeon was completely taken aback and blushing. Upon hearing those words from her student, she hadn't expected such a show of appreciation and support. "Be careful where you're touching," said Soyeon, making the protagonist blush deeply. He quickly pulled his hand back and began apologizing for everything. His words rushed as he tried to make up for any discomfort caused. In his sudden movement, his head hit the roof of the car. The impact was unexpected and painful, pulling a groan of pain from him. He was completely sore, and Soyeon noted he seemed very confused. Her tone filled with concern as she observed his reaction carefully. "Is Young still a baby?" asked Soyeon, intrigued, her voice a blend of teasing and curiosity. The protagonist, still in pain, responded firmly that he wasn't, his words steady as he tried to maintain his dignity. Soyeon could only look at him intently, her eyes reflecting a mixture of amusement and tenderness, as she couldn't help but smile at the situation, her cheeks lightly blushing. Then, Soyeon asked Jong to touch her, as he had done a moment before. Those words left Young stunned, unsure how to respond to the unexpected request. "Don't you want to?" asked Soyeon, her tone mixing curiosity and challenge. When he didn't respond, she took Young's hand and gently placed it on her chest, her heart beating quickly under his palm. The protagonist was completely overwhelmed as his hand rested there, touching something he'd never imagined he would. His thoughts were a whirlwind, trying to process what was happening. Without wasting any time, Young started moving his hands, a little awkwardly at first, each movement sending an electric current through Soyeon's body. She asked him to keep going, her voice between sighs, reflecting a mixture of pleasure and longing. After a heated moment, they both began to remove the clothes they were wearing, moving with a mix of urgency and shyness. Their clothes fell to the floor one by one, revealing the warm and trembling skin of both. They shared a passionate kiss, their lips meeting with an intensity that seemed to stop time. At one moment, Soyeon paused, and with a playful smile, told him to wait a moment so she could take off her glasses. They continued what they were doing, the closeness of their bodies heightening the tension and desire in the air. In the midst of the fervor, Soyeon paused and asked, "Was that your first kiss? I've shared so many of your first experiences today." Her tone was a mix of curiosity and pride, aware that she'd shared unique moments with him. After that intimate moment, Soyeon, with a tone full of tenderness, looked at Jason and asked if she could have him, hinting that she appreciated his understanding and patience. Her eyes reflected a blend of affection and need, and the atmosphere was charged with palpable intimacy. Young, still a bit dazed from the intensity of the moment, took a second to process what had been asked. Finally, without a second thought and with unexpected firmness, he responded with a simple yes. His voice was soft yet determined, revealing his willingness to continue with what they were both experiencing together. Young was completely terrified. Fear ran through his body, and despite his attempts to stay calm, he didn't know what to do in this situation. His hands shook slightly, and his breathing was somewhat irregular. Everything around him felt too tense, and uncertainty clouded his thoughts. Suddenly, Soyeon, with a smile that seemed full of confidence, indicated that he should remove his clothes so they could enjoy themselves. She said with a softness that contrasted with Young's internal chaos. But just before he began undressing, Soyeon, with slow, assured movements, approached him and started touching him. Her hands were warm, and the simple touch made Young's body tense up even more. Gently, Soyeon asked him to lie down. Her voice was calm, as if there was no rush at all. Then, with an almost playful smile, she asked him to open his legs slightly so she could get more comfortable. Young was bewildered, completely out of sorts, and the blush on his face was unmistakable. He couldn't believe what was happening. In front of him was his teacher, the woman everyone on campus considered a goddess, unattainable. Yet there she was, above him in a way he'd never imagined. Soyeon, for her part, couldn't help but be surprised to see how, despite his evident nervousness, Young was brimming with energy. She hadn't expected that, and this sudden realization made her feel a slight pang of embarrassment. "Absolutely not," Young exclaimed, as if wanting to dispel any doubt about how he felt. His voice was firm, though somewhat shaky from emotion. "I think you're beautiful," he blurted before he could even think about it, and at that precise moment, silence took over the room. Those unexpected and genuine words made Soyeon blush as red as a tomato. Jong's words completely disarmed her, and the blush spread across her cheeks, betraying the calm she always tried to maintain. Without thinking much, Soyeon started to stroke Jason gently, as if wanting to return some of the sweetness he had given her with his words. "Thank you," she whispered with a shy smile on her lips. Passion, however, was still overwhelmed with embarrassment. He didn't know how to react to what was happening. While she caressed him gently, he couldn't help but feel slightly out of place, noticing how Soyeon seemed to be taking the reins of the situation, doing all the work without needing to exchange any more words. They both let themselves be carried away by the moment. The initial tension began to dissipate, and they simply started to enjoy the beautiful night surrounding them, as if the world around them had ceased to exist for a while. Hours continued to pass, one after another, and Yuna lay in her bed, unable to sleep. She stared at the ceiling, fully awake, immersed in her thoughts. She couldn't stop thinking about Jason, wondering why he hadn't returned despite how late it already was. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, the driver Jason had called was walking down the street, looking for him insistently. He had been circling around, waiting to see him appear at any moment, but nothing. The driver began approaching a line of parked cars, hoping that maybe Jason was waiting near one of them, perhaps distracted or dancing around. There were so many vehicles in the area that it was hard to tell which was which, but that didn't deter him. Suddenly, something caught his attention. A strange sound broke the night's silence. He focused his hearing, and when he turned his head, he saw one of the parked cars moving unexpectedly. The scene unsettled him a bit, but he decided to approach cautiously. He moved closer to the vehicle and upon arrival tapped on the window. "I'm the driver," he called out, expecting a response. "I'm here to drive." But in that moment, everything changed. Suddenly, hands appeared out of nowhere and banged on the window, making the driver jump in fright. His heart skipped a beat, and for a second, fear paralyzed him. He hadn't expected it at all, and his mind went blank. He began hearing muffled sounds from inside the car, soft but unmistakable sounds breaking the night's stillness. The driver stood there for a moment, trying to process what he was hearing. He turned away, muttering curses under his breath, frustrated at having been called for something like this. How shameless can they be doing that here? He thought, grumbling, clearly annoyed by the situation he'd been put in. His patience was at its limit. He couldn't believe Yong had put him through this. Hours passed slowly, and finally, the day began to break with the first rays of sunlight. Inside the car, Soyeon and Yong were still asleep, embraced and completely exhausted after having exercised together all night. "Miss Soyeon, thank you so much for your kindness," Yong murmured, still half asleep. His voice was soft but couldn't hide his gratitude. The words slipped from his mouth almost automatically, as if it was the most natural thing to say. Although something inside him told him it might not have been the best way to start the conversation, Soyeon gave him a playful smile and gently tapped his forehead. "Don't you dare greet me like that," she joked, though with a touch of authority she couldn't help as a teacher. "Then how should I?" he asked with genuine curiosity, trying to decipher the game Soyeon had started. The teacher leaned toward him slightly, and whispering in a soft but firm voice, said, "You should tell me it was nice working out with me." Her words made the tension of the moment dissipate, and her tone suggested that everything had been part of a shared experience, something between the two of them. Before parting, Soyeon gave him one last smile and winked, clearly signaling that this should stay between them. There was no need to say it, but the message was received loud and clear. What had happened that night was to remain a secret. However, Jong was still uncertain how to react. It was his first time in a situation like that, and his mind was still processing everything that had happened. Later, Yang was on his knees with his hand raised in a sign of surrender, and Yuna, with a frown, looked down at him, reproaching him for not calling or responding to her messages. For her, that was an unforgivable disrespect, and she made it clear in a tone that showed her displeasure. "What were you doing yesterday to be returning at this hour?" she blurted out, her voice laden with frustration. Yang swallowed hard, searching for an answer, but the words wouldn't come. How was he going to explain to his aunt that he had to keep his teacher's secret? He knew he couldn't tell her the truth, but didn't want to keep lying to her either. At that moment, he felt the tension choking him. Meanwhile, Yuna kept reprimanding him without showing any signs of stopping. Nayeon, who was watching the scene from the side, smiled with satisfaction, clearly enjoying seeing Jason under pressure, trying to justify his actions. The protagonist began to stammer, but the memory of what had happened the night before left him speechless again. He felt the heat rise to his face, and a slight blush began to color his cheeks, betraying his thoughts. Unable to hold Yuna's gaze, he turned his head to the side, as if trying to escape her inquisitive eyes. "Kanjong, put those arms down," she said, exhaling a sigh of patience. "Look, I know you're not one to do foolish things when you go out, so I won't pressure you any further. But please, if you're not coming back, at least send me a message." Jong couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and remorse. He regretted making her worry like that. In a low, apologetic voice, he began to apologize, promising that next time he would send a text to keep her updated. Yuna, now calmer, nodded and gave him a smile of understanding. "All right, I'll stop scolding you, but from now on, let's keep in better communication, okay?" Seeing the understanding expression on his aunt's face, Yang felt the tension in his body slowly dissipate, and a smile appeared on his face. Have you eaten breakfast? Yuna asked with a curious look and a hint of concern in her voice. Seeing Yang shake his head, she didn't hesitate to head to the kitchen, ready to prepare something for him. I made some ramen this morning. Would you like to try it? Yuna offered as she served a steaming bowl and placed it in front of him. The aroma filled the room, though the smell was somewhat strong. Yuna immediately turned toward her daughter, who was watching the scene from the doorway. Would you like some too? She asked. However, her daughter quickly moved aside, as if the mere idea of eating her mother's food was uncomfortable. Without thinking much, Hong grabbed the chopsticks and started to try the ramen. But as soon as the first bite hit his taste buds, he felt a strange and unpleasant taste. He frowned, and unable to help himself, he jumped up, causing Yuna to startle, looking at him with wide eyes and surprise. Would you like us to cook together? He asked, giving a smile that, though it seemed friendly, hid a bit of his dissatisfaction with the taste. He tried to smooth over the situation, wanting to avoid making Yuna feel bad about the food. As he rolled up his sleeves, he began to explain to her that the ramen had turned out odd, maybe because she had been distracted watching videos on her phone while cooking. Yuna laughed, enjoying the moment, and then curiously asked if his mother had taught him to cook, surprised that he had those skills in the kitchen. Jong shook his head with a calm smile and explained that he had learned on his own, thinking that someday, when he lived on his own, he could prepare his own meals. Finally, when they finished cooking, Yang served her a portion of what he had prepared. With a satisfied expression, he asked his aunt if she wanted to try it. Yuna took a spoonful of the food Yang had served her, and as soon as the flavor touched her tongue, a smile spread across her face. It was the first time she had tasted something so delicious, and she seemed unable to contain her joy. Her eyes lit up, and she let out a giggle of satisfaction, savoring every bite. "It's delicious!" she exclaimed, almost jumping with happiness. "I don't know how you did it, but this tastes completely different from what I made. Much better." With a knowing smile, she approached Yang and, lowering her voice, whispered tenderly, "Did you know that Nayeon has been happier since you arrived? I'm so grateful that the house is filled with vitality, thanks to you." Suddenly, with a warm expression, Yuna gently took Jason's hand in hers. "Jason, thank you so much for coming to live here. You've made us so happy," she said, looking into his eyes. The young man felt his cheeks turn red, feeling the warm contact of Yuna's hand. However, what neither of them knew was that from behind the door, Nayeon had been silently listening to the entire conversation, spying. She seemed to love watching them interact and enjoy those little moments of closeness. They were so immersed in the conversation that they forgot that the kitchen was still on. A thick vapor began to rise from the kettle left on the stove. Yuna, realizing it, quickly tried to take it off, but in doing so, she burned her hand, letting out a small yelp of pain. "Ouch!" she exclaimed, quickly pulling her sore hand away, while Yang looked at her with concern, clearly scared by what had just happened. In her haste, Yuna lost her footing and began to fall toward the floor, but Yang, reacting instinctively, rushed forward and managed to cushion Yuna's fall, catching her just in time to prevent her from getting hurt. Both lay on the floor, relieved that everything had ended with just a scare. However, in the middle of the fall, Yang, trying to hold on to Yuna, accidentally grabbed her chest. It was a moment of confusion in which both froze, processing what had just happened. Yuna, realizing where Yang's hands were, began to stammer, as if her brain had gone blank. She could hardly believe what was happening and tried to collect her thoughts, though no words came out. Her face turned a crimson shade that seemed to deepen with each passing second. The heat rose from her neck to her cheeks, unable to hide her embarrassment. Yang was undoubtedly overwhelmed as well, but it was Yuna who felt her heart pounding in that awkward moment, where he was still touching her unintentionally, but with all the clumsiness of the situation.